Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's 21 Counties 21st Century virtual town hall. My name is Lyndsay Ruotolo, and I have the honor and privilege of serving Union County as its acting prosecutor. At the outset today, I would like to thank Attorney General Grewal for recognizing the critical importance of seeking and obtaining community input in the revision process for New Jersey's use of force policy, which is being revised for the first time in 20 years. When he began the 2121 project in 2018, General Grewal made clear that open lines of communication between law enforcement and the communities we serve is critical to effectively address the safety concerns of the public, and never before has that been more true than today. In the wake of George Floyd's killing and in the midst of a health crisis that highlights social and racial inequities, our nation finds itself, as it has before and surely will again, in a moment of reckoning. But reckonings bring change, and change brings progress. Many facets of society, from healthcare to housing to education, are part of a larger national conversation about fairness. And our profession, that of law enforcement, is at the center of this important public discourse. Our ability to do our jobs and secure justice and safety for the residents of this county relies on the community's trust on us. To be clear, we cannot do our jobs well when the community we serve does not trust us. Trust is not given, trust is earned. This unprecedented moment that we all find ourselves in requires us to question how we do what we do, scrutinize how we measure success in this field, and re-examine the role of law enforcement in society. There are many areas that need redress, but none are more critical to the community's trust than looking at the use of force by police. Here in Union County, we have been working to ensure that our law enforcement officers resort to force only when absolutely necessary, and when it is necessary, that force is used with restraint and in the safest way possible. To do so, we have revisited officer training, stressing defensive tactics and de-escalation techniques, developed early warning systems to identify weaknesses in officer training and conduct so that we can address it before it ever becomes a problem, and we've increased our focus on mental health issues. I am proud of the many steps we have already taken across the county, but our work is not done. For law enforcement to truly serve our community, it must be a part of that community, and we must be sensitive to the needs of its members. That can only be achieved through a constant dialogue. And today's program is one of the ways in which we hope to foster a productive community-wide conversation. At Attorney General Grewal's direction, each of the 21 county prosecutors began having conversations, both formally and informally, about how the communities we serve view use of force, policies, and their concerns. The goal being that we could report back the concerns and suggestions we hear from our community partners so that those concerns and suggestions could be considered in revising the state's use of force policy. The use of force policy gives guidance to law enforcement officers about when and how force can be used to gain compliance with a lawful objective of the police. Officers are permitted to use force, but only that which is objectively reasonable and necessary. The Office of the Attorney General has pledged to issue its revised policy, taking into account the input from the public by the end of 2020. In order to facilitate a meaningful conversation today, our office solicited questions from the public in advance of this afternoon's webinar. We then assembled a panel of experts to answer and respond to the questions that were submitted. We're also continuing to accept questions as we're live, so you can email those to ucpooutreach@ucnj.org. This video of today's panel discussion will also be made available, and people who watch it later could continue to submit questions, and we will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible during our panel discussion. But anything that we don't cover, we're committed to trying to answer either on our website, through social media, or through our actions. We greatly appreciate your interest and input, so please keep the questions and comments and suggestions coming. We'll also show at the end the website for the OAG's portal for use of force suggestions, which will be open until August 1st. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's panelists. So just bear with us while we get all of their screens active. But joining us first, please welcome Jonathan Parham. Director Parham is the Director of Countywide Police Policy, Training, and Planning here at the Union County Prosecutor's Office. Before that, before joining our leadership team, Jonathan was the Undersheriff with oversight over professional standards as well as performance management, among many other things. And before that, Director Parham was the Chief of the Linden Police Department. At Linden, Director Parham strengthened community relations by surveying Linden residents on their perception of local crime, then identifying ways to expand the department's visibility and transparency for the public. He also standardized agency training and installed and used body-worn cameras as a way to allow the Linden Police Department to address performance-related issues surfacing in interactions with the public. That endeavor at Linden has now been expanded countywide when last week, Director Parham launched a new body-worn camera pilot program here in Union County. Director Parham is an expert in the area of police training, defensive tactics, de-escalation technique, and risk mitigation in law enforcement. Thanks for joining us, Director Parham.
Prosecutor.
Also joining us from the Linden Police Department, we have with us Chief Hart. Chief Hart had been a member of the Linden Police Department for 30 years when he became chief in 2017. In addition to his work in policing, Chief Hart has been the coordinator of the Linden Office of Emergency Management since 2016 and served as the deputy coordinator for 13 years before then. He holds a certification in emergency management and as a paramedic. Under Chief Hart's leadership, Linden PD was one of 6 departments selected by the Office of the Attorney General to participate in a pilot program for the newly created use of force portal at the end of last year. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you.
Also from Linden PD, we have with us today Captain Abdul Williams. Captain Williams has been with Linden PD for, I believe, 19 years, and during that time has served in various roles from school resource officer, DARE officer, and has hosted the Linden Police Youth Academy. He served as the commander of the Narcotics Bureau and was a big proponent of Project Medicine Drop in Union County when it started. Captain Williams is also widely known statewide for his leadership and expertise in crisis intervention team training. He currently serves as the county's coordinator in that effort. He has received several commendations and awards for excellence in policing and his work in the mental health field. Welcome, Captain. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would also like to give a very special welcome and thank you to Bishop Manuel Donelson for joining us today for this important conversation. I know you're outnumbered here, but by law enforcement, but we are so grateful to have you. Bishop Donelson is the lead pastor and founder of Expect a Miracle Ministries. He serves as the supervising police chaplain in the Linden Police Department. He is president of the Linden Dr. Martin Luther King Commemorative Committee and is the executive director of Masterpiece Program, a community outreach program in Linden that provides all-year sports recreation programming and mentorship to over 100 young adults weekly. Bishop Donelson holds a bachelor's and master's in public administration from Kane, where he serves as an adjunct professor in the School of Business and Public Administration. And Bishop Donelson is a decorated veteran, having served the United States Army during Operation Desert Storm, receiving the Southwest Asia Service Medal and 2 Bronze Stars for his heroism and achievements in service. Thank you, distinguished panelists, for joining us today. I'm so grateful to have all of you with us. I'm really hopeful that today will be a meaningful and impactful conversation that will give us some takeaways as to how we can improve community and police relations, as well as inform positive policy reform. As I mentioned, we sent a survey to everyone who RSVP'd for this event and collected questions and areas and topics that they wish to cover. We're also going to keep collecting emails as we go. So what I've done is I've kind of gone through the questions, and I'll direct them to someone who might be an appropriate person to answer it. But at any point, if everybody wants to weigh in, please don't hesitate. We'll get used to this virtual setup. The very first question we have has a follow-up that pertains specifically to police training. So Director Parham, I'm going to start this one with you. One of our attendees wants a better understanding of the types of force that are permitted and when and why they are used. But as a follow-up to that question, in case it's part of your answer, is how officers are trained to control people who resist arrest. So I'll let you take that.
Thank you, Prosecutor. Initially, there is a doctrine that pretty much states what levels of force officers can use. It is an AG directive that guides the use of force for police officers when they are dealing or trying to carry out the police function. It begins with just their mere presence or constructive authority. It then escalates to them, their hands on someone to escort them, physical contact. It goes from there to maybe they have to use control maneuvers such as a wrist lock or a shoulder or an arm bar to control someone that's resisting. That's that physical force. Then we get from there to mechanical force. If they have to use a device to assist them in subduing someone, enhanced mechanical is the next level, which is right below deadly force. Enhanced mechanical could be the conductive energy devices or the tasers that are in use. And then obviously at the end, there is the deadly force, and that is any force that has the likelihood of causing serious bodily injury or death. That's the legal doctrine that controls the force, but the maneuvers that officers use are taught to them in the academy and in service training, and they mostly deal with trying to control a person to the point where they use enough force to subdue the person so that they can get them into handcuffs and then process them as an arrest or take them to a hospital for treatment.
Thank you very much. Chief Hart, I'm going to direct this one to you. We received several questions about transparency when it comes to use of force reporting. So I think it might be helpful if you could walk us through what happens every time an officer needs to use force in the exercise of their duties.
Thank you, Prosecutor. All officers in the state of New Jersey are guided by the Attorney General guidelines and policies set by your office. With that being said, every use of force that an officer is involved with, every officer involved in every use of force must complete a report. Now we're doing digital reports. So if there was 5 officers at a scene of an arrest and the force was necessary, legal force was necessary to arrest someone, every officer involved in that use of force would have to submit a report. Now it's digitally done, and it's put into the new use of force portal, which was brought out by the Attorney General, instituted several months ago. Now it's gone live statewide. So every use of force is documented by every officer individually. It's put into this new portal, which, as you mentioned earlier, Linden was one of the 6 communities in New Jersey part of this pilot test program, and it's been rolled out now full-time to all departments statewide. Once this is entered into the portal, the officer's immediate supervisor has an obligation to review this on that shift, to review, make sure it was filled out correctly, and also to review the body-worn camera, body-worn camera footage correlating to that arrest. From there, it's in the portal, and then it gets passed on to a second review process. It goes to our professional standards unit, which many know as the internal affairs unit or professional standards, make sure policies and training are done correctly. This is reviewed by a second set of supervisors to ensure the form, again, is filled out correctly. They review body-worn camera footage to make sure things are legal, things are proper, and all policies mandated by the Attorney General's office have been followed. So it's a 2-step process. The public needs to be reassured. Every officer must fill this out. It is reviewed by their immediate supervisor and secondary review by professional standards within the police department. If there's anything that's found to be improper or questionable, whether a procedure or some type of law was followed correctly, this then will go on to the local prosecutor's office, and here be Union County Prosecutor for further review. If there's any question from our professional standards unit whether something was not followed correctly or a possible legal issue, then of course your office would review it, with either remand it back to us or further review possibly by the Attorney General's office. So that's generally the process for use of force here in the county. and it's a mandated policy that all officers in our department and countywide are following.
Thank you very much, Chief, for that. Bishop, I wonder if I could turn to you. With having heard the Chief describe the process and the steps that are taken by law enforcement, the fact that it goes to multiple units within a department, direct supervisor, professional standards, and then to an outside agency, should there be something improper. As a layperson, do you see something that we're missing? Is there a step that we might take or add that could improve the community's trust in that review process?
Yes, thank you, Prosecutor. One of the things I would say, thank you, Chief, is the steps were clearly defined, but also is to continue to build that trust is the communication. A lot of times there's a lack of communication between our law enforcement and the community they serve. So I think that's important. And we talked about trust. So some of the things that I think are important with the word trust, even if you break it down in an acronym, you want to start off with truth. Always start off with truth. And that's real important to make sure that everything that's related to the community is factual, evidence-based, not hyperbole, not what people said. These are the facts. This is the truth. And then respect. Going into any community, you want to have respect for that community because, you know, once again, that relationship is based on mutual respect, but also is based on the people's impression of police officers uses from their last encounter or from what they believe, sometimes their images, you know, protect and serve. So that respect has to be there. Then an understanding that the community, especially depending on what it is, may be hurting. So there may be a need to resolve things quicker, faster, impulse, but just to make sure all parties involved understand what's going on, understanding there is a process, continue to communicate that process, and understand that there's some timelines attached to that process because some things simply just don't happen overnight. And then I'll talk about service. Once again, that protect and serve. Provide excellent customer service to the community is so important because a lot of times we forget about that. We forget about that we're there to serve, the police are there to serve, they're there to protect, but they also want to make sure the community, like anything else they do, when they come into their doors or when they go into the community, they're there to provide a service. They're not there to pick sides, to put their biases down, because all of us are vulnerable to biases. Anybody who says they don't have them is probably not being totally honest with themselves. But as a professional, you know to put those to the side and making sure you're going into that community to provide a service. And last thing, transparency, just being transparent. I think that's so important. Putting everything out there, making sure you know what we know as much as legally they can share, I should say. Because sometimes there's things they can't share, but they need to make sure the public knows that this is what we can share, and at a later date, we'll be able to share more once we gather more evidence and more information. So I think that's important when we look at just trust.
Thank you very much for that, Bishop. Really, I want to go back to where you started, and then I'll let everybody else weigh in. And I just have to comment on your service thing. I think that is so important. It's so often we forget in this field because we're operating in emergencies that every industry is a service industry. And I will tell you, in recruitment, I often love when I see on someone's resume retail, restaurant service, because anyone who can handle the customer service requirements of those two fields, it serves them well in any. But going back to communication, how that is so key. And yes, we do these webinars, and we, before COVID, we were going out and it was always in person. And Linden PD is one of is just really an example of how to do that well in the community. But especially now in this prolonged period of virtual interaction, how can we better communicate? No one follows us on social media and no one's checking our website. So how can we do a better job at communication?
Right. I think you use your community partners too. You use those in the community and definitely those community partners. Some of those community partners are like myself, they're pastors, and they already have relationships with community members, community leaders, and that they can help disseminate information by way of their worship services, by way of their conference calls, their prayer sessions. They can help there. Those other community partners, because we're in this together. it takes everybody. So you're talking about even education, you got the Board of Education. So that's another community partner to help, because they disseminate information through PTA. They disseminate information, especially right now, preparing for return to school during COVID. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of meetings going on, but that's another opportunity to help share information, present opportunities of dialogue. And I think also, and not to forget our commerce, our businesses too. Posting information in businesses, sharing information with businesses. But one of the things Linden does well is a lot of community policing. So the more there's a relationship, right? Because everybody understands their role. When people see the police naturally, they know the police have a role too. Yes, they're there to build a relationship, but they also gotta, protect and serve. They also gotta be the lawmakers, if you will, or service the law. So it's important for us to just have a relationship with all those community partners, but also continuing to engage with the community. Because a lot of times we're reacting. The police are reacting to a situation instead of being proactive. Going out to those community events, showing up, playing, you see it on TV sometimes, playing basketball, shooting, or giving out, a couple years ago, I'll give you an example. Linden was giving out turkeys on Thanksgiving. And I did a ride along, if you will, with some of them. And I can tell you every house, this is a funny story. The officer I went with, I forgot his name, but it was years ago. Every house we went to, they was like, what's going on? What's wrong? And they had a bag of Thanksgiving, the fixings and a turkey. And they had to explain to every house we went to that they were here to just say Happy Thanksgiving and we wanted to give you a gift. But every house, what's going on? What's wrong? Their faces. And one lady was even like, whoo, she started panicking. And we walked to the car and both of us looked at that and said, that's an issue. That's an issue that we got to resolve, that just because you see the police, your blood pressure begins to rise, you get intimidated and you begin to get overly cautious. So but if they see the police in the community, they build relationships, they get to know them, then the relationship begins to change. I hope that answers your question.
Did, and then some. Thank you. Does anybody else want to touch that one before we move on, or?
I'll weigh in a little bit on the Bishop's comment. And for the law enforcement side, what it means for us is that we have to do our part in developing and building those relationships. And some of that plays out in the academy, the way that we're trained, and the way that we're socialized in the police department. What we perceive to be our job. For example, if we think that we are crime fighters, then that becomes the top of the list for us, that we are not service oriented, we are fighting crime. We're looking to arrest, we're looking to use force, even judicious or rightful force. But those are concerns. How we perceive ourselves has an effect on how the public perceives us as well. So if we don't perceive ourselves as part of the community, or we don't perceive ourselves as guardians of the community, and we see ourselves as outside affecting force or law onto the community, then that we should not be surprised in if people aren't happy to see us. It won't always be a pleasant experience. A training officer when I was younger, and he explained to me that I was sitting in the car and I was bored, quite honestly. And I said, I really wish something would happen. I want to go out and do something. And it explained to me how sad that statement was. And I didn't understand. He said, you're sitting here wanting something to happen, and recognize that excitement for you is somebody's worst day. It is the things that they never want to happen. And here it is happening. And you're taking joy in that just so that you can be excited, so that you can pass some time. And that stuck with me from that moment up until now. The excitement for us doing our job and how we perceive it, could be someone's worst day. It could be our worst day, or our cousins, or our friends, or someone. And just understanding that allows us to enter that engagement or that interaction with empathy, which of course allows us to color the way that we interact with the community. So we have to do our part, and it starts with understanding how we are perceived and even perceive ourselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. Unless anybody has anything, then I want to move on to the next area. Before getting to the question, much of the conversation surrounding police use of force centers around the disparate treatment of communities of color, but there is also a need to address use of force as it relates to individuals with mental illness. General Graywall's expansion of CIT training across the state is one of the ways to address that concern. But Linden was really proactive in that from the very beginning. And Captain Williams, I was wondering if, since much of your work has centered around police interaction with people struggling with mental health issues, substance abuse, and those in crisis, if you could share with those who are attending this to give them a sense of what CIT really is, and any observations you might have given your work in that area about the impact of that training when you're in the field.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd have to say thank you to Director Parham for actually bringing me into the CIT fold. He and I went to the training to become the coordinators for Union County 10 years ago. Also, thank you to you, Madam Prosecutor, and Attorney General Graywall for your support, even when he was the Bergen County prosecutor. He supported that program quite often. First thing you need to know is what CIT is, or how it started, how it was birthed. In 1987, a young African-American male threatening citizens with a knife. Police were called. The interaction ended with that individual losing his life. There were protests. The mayor got together with the police, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Memphis University had a big hand in it, hospital administration, church officials, and basically they wanted to find a better approach to deal with people with mental illness. And since was born the CIT, what's known as the Memphis model, which is what everybody pretty much follows at this point in time. In 2007 in Camden County, CIT was brought into New Jersey under the Center of Excellence. Now, CIT isn't just training of officers. A lot of people think that I can train officers and that's it. It actually is a collaboration between law enforcement, prosecutors, the judiciary, mental health providers, community stakeholders, to better provide a comprehensive approach to better serving those suffering with a mental illness. When you look at it, you're really attempting to do jail diversion, decriminalizing of a mental illness. And I always like to say odd behavior doesn't make it criminal behavior. Also, referrals towards services to allow people who may be suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness, provide them with services that were unbeknownst to them. It's also a reduction of stigma. So I've been doing this for the last 10 years. We've trained in Union County over 700 students, and that would include over 500 law enforcement officers, mental health workers, as well as other community stakeholders, pharmacy reps. Basically, and all this is with an emphasis on de-escalation. With the de-escalation, there's a reduction in the use of force, so a reduction in subject injury or death, reduction in officer injury or death, and hopefully a reduction in liability for the city and the departments. However, with the training, it cannot stop at just training. You need to continue with awareness, outreach. In Linden, what we've done is we've done a lot of community outreach. I sat on the executive board of Bridgeway Rehabilitation Center. We hold an Easter egg hunt for children with developmental disabilities, and we've done that for the last 8 years. We've also held a community barbecue for those suffering with a mental illness, mental health workers, and the families for the last 7 years. All of this has allowed us to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, especially the mental health community. And we have seen a reduction in the use of force when dealing with mental health, with the mentally ill, as well as the reduction in officers' use of force when dealing with people with mental illness. But training cannot stop. It needs to adapt along with enhanced training when it comes to juveniles, veterans, and other portions of that community.
Could I ask you a follow-up on that, Captain? With respect to the training, you mentioned that you train not only law enforcement, but also first responders and, you know, those who are actually in mental health services. You train them together, right? They train as a team. That's
Yes.
the critical part of this, right?
Yes, and forgive me for that. CIT
No.
basically stands for Crisis Intervention Team. And that was one of the biggest processes of getting everyone to know where they fit in the team. As law enforcement, as the director will know, and Chief Hart, when we first got on, we didn't see ourselves as part of that team. It was law enforcement dealt with things the way we deal with them. And if someone from a mental health facility or a mental health worker was calling us, it was almost as if we had to do their job for them. We did not realize that it has to be a collaborative effort and has to be a team effort. So that helps us better serve when we all realize where we are in the team. And it will help bridge that gap so that when you have a person suffering from a mental illness, if you're referring them to services because you're now aware of those services and you actually have that relationship, that you more or less will hopefully not have to deal with the same people on a regular basis. You're not going to get the recidivism of dealing with the same individual over and over again. And hopefully that you're going to get them the help that they need. In law enforcement, we've all said that we enter this job to help people. And this is one way that we can actually help as far as knowing where we stand in that team and how we fit.
And that, for those who are joining us virtually, that training is a 40-hour intensive training as a team over the course of 5 days in a row. So it's 1 week, and it's offered, I believe, twice a year here in Union County. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
is that right?
We actually, and forgive me,
No.
40 hours, we actually hold the class 3 times a year. We usually hold it in March, June, and then again in October. The class consists of usually 2/3 law enforcement, 1/3 mental health or other disciplines. We've trained local police, county police, state police, and federal officers as well. In Linden, we have the luxury of being able to train our telecommunicators as well, which they are the first, as far as I'm concerned, the first responders. They usually take the calls, and they have the information of the questions to ask to better send the right officers and to get information out. We also we train the family members. We've trained mental health employees. So that's pretty much the training. It's an emphasis on de-escalation. We don't try to turn officers into clinicians. We want them to be able to identify a person with a mental illness, not diagnose.
Right. Well, and you know, sorry, I don't want to stay on this too long because I know we have a lot of topics to cover, but shortly before the outbreak of COVID, you and I had a meeting about, and you sort of touched upon this in your comments about outreach efforts. And it's not just about outreach in communities or amongst people who might require this kind of mental health intervention. It's also with families of people who suffer from mental health issues, because often they're reticent to call the police when the police are necessary and hesitate sharing that really critical piece of information that their loved one is in a mental health crisis at the time that they're calling. So one of the things we talked about doing, and something that, you know, we talk about every time we talk about crisis intervention team, is educating the public about the existence of this and the prevalence of trained officers here in Union County, so that one, they don't hesitate to call the police, and two, when they do, in that critical moment of calling 911, they share with the dispatcher that this is someone in crisis, so that we can try to get someone from our department who is CIT trained to be one of the people responding. And it just brings a really volatile police community interaction down a notch and lets everybody have the information necessary when they walk in the door. And to the extent we're able to accommodate that request and send somebody to the scene who has that critical training, you know, we can do so.
Yeah,
So,
yes. Once COVID is pretty much lifted and gone, we already have the areas where we'd like to hit just for education and to pass out information for people to know what resources are out there. I think it's going to be big, not just for those with a history of a mental illness, but it's going to be big for, I think, general society because of COVID, because of the unrest going on. I think people may be suffering a mental health crisis and not realizing what options are out there for them. Not necessarily that they suffer from a mental illness, but mental health crisis. And it's going to be big for people to know what resources are out there, not just if you suffer from a mental illness.
exactly.
And Prosecutor, if you don't mind me
Please
asking,
call me Lyndsay, please. Okay.
you asked earlier about disseminating that information or getting it out there to the public. I would also add social media, because I think that's so important. I know it happens here. I'm in Linden. They have a Facebook page, but I think that anytime law enforcement could effectively use social media to engage the community with information, whether it's a PSA, a public service announcement, whether it's feel-good stories. I know what really helps is when people see themselves in a commercial, like the community, those feel-good stories, that's your PR branch, their public relations. Capture that and push that back out, because that type of information needs help to travel. I heard somebody say a long time ago, good news needs help, but bad news doesn't, right? Because people instantly call and start talking about it. But good things happen every day in law enforcement, but nobody knows about it.
That's really helpful. And I expect that everybody attending will be following us on Twitter by the end of this, because we're getting out there. I know Linden's pretty active online too, but it's a good point. And I think, Jonathan, you could probably touch upon this in terms of, that we've recently launched this body-worn camera policy, and it's to kind of to evaluate certain metrics in certain incidents that police often do. And one of the criteria we have supervisors looking at is not just when something goes wrong, but it's when something goes so right that it's like an outstanding example of customer service or effective police work. And we don't often promote those moments and should. So I don't know if anybody wants to touch
Sure.
upon that.
But before I can go deeper into the body-worn camera issue, I will send a huge thank you out to Linden, Lieutenant Wigranak and Lieutenant Sanchez. When I was back in Linden, we worked feverishly building that program. We had a lot of fun building it, and I could not have done what we're doing here at the prosecutor's office without the help of those guys. So thank you to the entities. But as we move forward with this, it's about catching people doing something right. Law enforcement now is in a very rough position where they're feeling unwanted. They're feeling like the world is coming down on them. There is no doubt that there is an element of law enforcement that needs to leave. I don't think anyone would disagree with me. There are people there that should not be police officers. However, there are tons of cops who do the right thing and are feeling the brunt and the weight of those bad cops. That is just what it is. Our job now is to highlight the performance of police officers that are doing a good job and celebrate them, but also look for those little nuances where the performance may be slightly inconsistent with what our best practices are. We're not trying to catch you doing something bad, but if we see you're going off a little bit, we want to get to you before that mistake turns into misconduct. The whole idea of this is to get to it before it hits the news, before it hits internal affairs, before it becomes a tragedy. That's the idea. The true idea is catching someone doing something right, or catching them before it gets to the point where we have to take an action where the person is going to be disciplined. This particular program, and we're using 3 agencies, Cranford, Lozelle, and Plainfield, to kick it off. I couldn't be more happy with it, and I think it's something that gets pushed out throughout the state, but it's not about a gotcha. It's not about trying to wait for someone or watch someone and study everything that they do to see what goes wrong. What we also know is that law enforcement is goal-oriented. If the goal is to, say, catch the bad guy, and I'll use that term loosely, then there are times that we focus on achieving that objective without focusing on the process that we use to get there. And it's the process or the failure to follow the process properly that gets us jammed up. It's not following the rules all the way through and just trying to get to the end goal. Watching body cameras will allow us to identify where our officers are not necessarily following all of the rules so that we can counsel them and we can train them or retrain them and ensure that, as the bishop said, it's not just we're doing good performance, but that performance leads to good service delivery from a police standpoint.
Thanks. Anybody else want to touch upon that before we move on? All right. Well, we received a question about what this office's expectation is when it comes to use of de-escalation techniques before force is utilized by members of law enforcement. As it was posed to this office, I'll go ahead and touch upon it briefly, but then I'd really like to open this up to the group because I think it's a really important concern that we hear repeatedly right now. I think it was said before, and I can't remember whether it was captain or chief, but no officer wants to have to use force. The hope is always that they won't. But in terms of specific expectations that we have about de-escalation, I think it's really important to address this with the community about how much training goes into this, and that this, I believe, is an area where we can really improve. Because as it stands, our recruits get a half of a day of training during the academy specifically on de-escalation. It is an elective. It is not one of the required performance objectives. And this is statewide. This is not specific to the county, but this is just the recruits' curriculum. In service, we're talking about 10 to 12 hours a year, unless of course the officer takes an elective, which there are many that are being offered by private companies for de-escalation right now, or if the officer becomes CIT trained, UCERT, which is our emergency response team here in the county, or SWAT trained, they receive additional de-escalation technique training. But as a law enforcement leader, I feel a responsibility not just to protect the safety of the public, certainly that it always exists, but also to protect the safety of our officers. And we fail them both when we don't equip our officers going out into the field with all of the tools that can help them make sure that everyone goes home safe at the end of a call and at the end of a shift. So in my opinion, this is one of the areas that is ripe for improvement. And I think a lot of people, I certainly, before I entered, criminal prosecution as a line AP, I did not realize how little training we're giving our recruits going into this job when it comes to de-escalation. Now, we teach them many other things, and it probably comes into play in other classes, but formal classes where this is the primary goal of the course and the training, we can do more, or at least that's my opinion. And so it's hard to have specific expectations when we need to first provide them with our officers and our recruits with those tools going out into the field. So I think de-escalation has finally received the spotlight it deserves in the public discourse. And I'm curious, we have some real experts in law enforcement leadership here with us today. And if everybody wants to weigh in on that topic, I'll open it up to the group.
I'll jump in before everyone jumps. To reinforce what the prosecutor is saying, the Attorney General recognizes that that gap is there as well, meaning that the Police Training Commission is responsible for establishing the curriculum that is being taught in the academy, and that's why it's being updated, because there are some obvious gaps, and those gaps end up playing themselves out in the performance of officers on the street. So we know that there is a direct connection to what is being taught and how it relates to what the officer is doing, and that gap needs to be filled, and it's currently being reviewed at this point. There is another issue that is there, and it's officer competency. If the officer does not feel that they are properly trained or resourced in a particular tool, they won't use it. They won't have confidence in it. So consider de-escalation as a tool. Most people would think, well, that's just obvious. You should always do that. Well, you should do a lot of things, but if you're not trained to do them well, you won't do them. And that tool is something that officers need to be confident in, and they can only get confident by repetitive training, by making sure that that form of training is built into everything that they do. It said that we use our mouths far more than we use our weapons, than our firearms in law enforcement. Yet, if you compare de-escalation training to firearms training, I don't even think that there's certainly no comparison that firearms training certainly outweighs it. Now, that's not to say that we should do firearms training. It is to say that we should do de-escalation training and communication training a whole lot more. The point that I want to make is that the idea of de-escalation as a tool has to pair with the understanding and the empathy that an officer has, that that's another human being who is having their worst day when you've come into contact with them. That we should not use a conversation as a tactic to just pull information. It should be because we are trying to direct that person to the resources. And although most officers recognize that they have to get that job done to get to another job, these are the lives that we're dealing with. Empathy, de-escalation, and that personalization allow the officer to humanize the person they're dealing with. And when you're dealing with another human, it's difficult to go outside of using the appropriate amount of force. We want to make sure that that communication allows officers to continue to see other people in the community as humans.
Yeah, from a community perspective, I know you were talking to law enforcement. I think that compassionate piece in de-escalation that's a area of opportunity to grow. I really feel like, because I think that's what continues around the country, not our local issues here, but definitely around the country. That's what you see a lot of. There's the de-escalation that doesn't take place. That's usually, and rightfully so, probably what gets on video, because there's a situation that just could have really been handled so differently if somebody would remember this is a human being, and the words I use, and it's already a tense situation, to try to bring it down, and would have been resolved differently, one. And two, situations where there's no compassion again when somebody's under arrest or it did go wrong, where the use of force was a weapon, right? Like a Mike Brown case, remember that case? He was laying on the ground for hours in that community. It just enraged the community. And there's no way to explain that to people, that you could at least pick up somebody, right, and remove them from the view of the community who watched him get shot, but also just watched him lay there. So that's traumatizing. And now you have a bigger problem because you didn't go back to the basics, not valuing that partnership, because this is a partnership at the end of the day. So I think in that training, needs to be a constant reminder, you're there to build bridges into the community, not walls. You're not going there with a force field around you where I'm here to do a job. I'm a police officer now I'm about to, go, as you said, somebody said earlier, lock people up. You got to remember, this is now another branch of the community from a customer service standpoint. They're there to protect and serve, but they're also part of the community. Once again, we're in this together. Everybody plays a role. I don't expect the butcher, right, to be carrying handcuffs and a flashlight. Everybody plays a different role. The educators, they play a different role. But the community does too. And a lot of times people forget, you hear it all the time, well, you work for us. But people say that, but they don't really feel like that. So I think that de-escalation is a real important piece in that compassion when it's appropriate.
Thank you. And I'm glad you weighed in on that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to exclude you by directing it to the law enforcement. I appreciate you weighing in on that. Anybody else want to touch upon de-escalation?
Yeah, Prosecutor, I'll just mention the offshoot of CIT training just for a couple seconds. With COVID, now we've been put back several months of in-person training. I talked to Captain Williams. In addition to the CIT, which is the premier crisis intervention training for law enforcement and community, Captain and myself are going to make a pledge. We're going to be the first town in Union County and one of the first in the state to to pledge the One Mind campaign, which is a one-day mandatory, one-day training for mental health training for law enforcement. So this will supplement our CIT officers. I wanted to be the first to do it this year. With COVID, we've been pushed back now months. I talked about the captain the other day. I'm hoping to be the first town, Union County, to mandate all of our officers, from myself right on down to the junior officer, either have CIT training or One Mind campaign training, which is a one-day mental health mandatory training. It's going to be issued by this police department. If we can't get it done late this year, it'll be done sometime, hopefully early next year here.
Chief, that is an amazing pledge, and just tremendous leadership on your part and on the part of your entire department. Thank you, and thanks for sharing that with us today. Thank you. It's really, Captain, you too. That's just wonderful.
Thank you.
Wow, that's huge, Chief. Anybody else before we move on?
Yes, just to back up what Bishop Donelson said, and also Director Parham earlier used the term when speaking about law enforcement, which was guardian, as opposed to, you know, the thought of being that gladiator or that warrior. And Bishop Donelson saying, you got to know your roles. If we take on that guardian mentality, we realize that, you know, the catch the bad guys is just a small portion of it. And when we add in all the other things that are required of us right now by the community, which they have the right to require us to be more than just the law guys, we have to be more, and we have to know what our roles are, and our roles are not just single folded any longer. So de-escalation, it has to be emphasized the same way other things are within the academy, as the director was saying about firearms. We need to put an emphasis on that, as well as all the other aspects of our profession at this point in time.
And I think the fact that the PTC is looking at it statewide is just another example of how, you know, the Attorney General and this state really leads in a lot of respects. And I'll be really excited to see how that develops in terms of the next curriculum that comes out of that office. That's really wonderful. In the meantime, we should do something here. So we'll get to work on that. But I want to move on to the next topic, which we received several questions about accountability generally in law enforcement. And so it's not a specific question. It was more just general, please address this topic. So I'd like to open that up to the entire group to talk about both what our current accountability measures are and where we see room for improvement there. So if anybody would like to jump in and start, we'll just open that one up to the whole group.
Waiting on you, Chief.
I'll segue into you. Go ahead.
So obviously the formal stance for accountability is internal affairs. It is the function that's established in every department that is based upon the Attorney General guidelines that dictates how complaints are received, what happens to them once they are received, and what the recourse is after the complaints are investigated, and how we move on. I actually look at internal affairs as reactive, and I think that we all do. The I do see is that it is just that. It is reactive. It waits for something to happen for us to take a look at it. What we also know is that each department, each agency has a different standard for what recourse they will take when a complaint has been sustained. And I'll use coming in late as an easy example. So for one agency, coming in late will get you a finger wag, and the agency will suspend you for a day. That type of inconsistency does not breed trust within the ranks. It doesn't say to the rank and file officer that we will all be treated fairly. We think about obviously the use of force with the community and establishing trust, but we cannot exclude the trust that needs to be built from within. And that is that law enforcement officers must trust their leadership, and they must trust the agency's guidelines and SOPs and be certain that they are there to protect them. The mindset that I don't think is foreign to anyone here is that most people look at policy and procedure not as a guide for your performance, but as a way to catch you when you do something wrong. Just perception needs to change. So not only do we need to look at things on the outside, we need to have a serious look at how we deal with ourselves. How do law enforcement leaders deal with their own? And are we treating each other fairly so that we exhibit that trust that we expect the public to have in us? If we can't trust ourselves by not showing a level of competency and a level of making sure that things are standardized, then we certainly cannot expect the public to trust us. There's no need to go into depth, but there are a bunch of police officers who said, hey, I expect the public, I expect people, that I'm chasing or that I'm dealing with to do what they do. They fit their mold. But what I don't expect is to come back to the police headquarters and have those people treat me differently or like one person more than another or hand out one level of justice to one person differently from another. That level of consistency does not bring about trust within the department. So we need to work on that as well.
And that's an important point there, Director. Thank you. Anybody else want to touch upon this? And I'll jump in, and I think there are ways that we're seeking to improve that accountability of trust from on the inside of agencies. And I think one of them is to, there's this move to put out great policies and thoughtful policies, but then there needs to be that second step of, it can't just exist on paper. We need to train, we need to educate. Otherwise that perception of the gotcha is going to continue, as opposed to the real intent behind these policies and procedures that all of us in leadership put out. And that is to support our people, to help them do their job better. And I think training and taking the time, which right now in the midst of COVID is exceptionally hard. You can't just pull everybody into the conference room and do a quick training on something new. It has to be more thoughtful and more planned, but there are certainly ways that we can really improve the perception internally. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind as leadership. But does anybody else want to talk about accountability before we move on? So the next topic that, again, we received several questions on, and we touched upon this a little bit already with better ways to communicate, but we did receive several questions about how to facilitate meaningful community conversations between police officers and residents. I know that Linden does a ton in the area of community outreach, so maybe this would be an opportunity to share a little bit about what we all currently do, how we might be able to improve upon that, and what, if any, responsibility the community has when it comes to building that bridge and maintaining that relationship. So
I'll lead off, Prosecutor.
Thanks, Chief.
Thanks. As I spoke the other day about, we had our private discussion, Linden last year did the most community outreach in the history of the police department. This involves not just going to calls and being nice and good community service, community interaction with a victim. It also entails reaching out to the churches within our town, faith-based community, our business community, and most definitely our school community. Any request for public outreach usually comes through my office. Some of the guys and girls here, the men and ladies, sometimes get upset because I don't say no to really anything here. Even if one car goes for 5 minutes to say hello, we try to do as much outreach. The captain will tell you at our meetings, we got more, when we're pre-COVID anyway, every week we had multiple events we had to attend to. Also part of this, we have an ambassador program in our patrol division. We have 4 or 5 officers on each patrol shift. If it's just a police car to come by and say hello to an event or stop and see kids at a park, we try to use our ambassadors. These are most of them younger officers who have a keen interest in our community. And they respond to a school and have pizza with a kid at a safety fair, or go stop and play basketball at a basketball tournament for 5 minutes. But our ambassador program has been a huge success here in Linden. As long as I'm chief, we're going to continue to push community outreach, community policing. I think all police departments, regardless of size, nationwide now, over the last several years, are seeing this. We are crime fighters. We do enforce laws, regulations, traffic violations, but community policing and de-escalation all ties together here. when we are part of the community, it makes many of our other issues and possible problems down the road easier to deal with. We bring our faith-based ministers on board in our churches, in particular our schools. It's a big thing when the police department is part of this community. The police need the community needs us, and it is a joint partnership, which I'm real proud now in Linden. I think we have a good handle. There's always room for improvement, and we're going to continue with our community outreach.
And I would add to that, that's so important, like at the time, Chief Parham, we initiated the chaplaincy program, and then we expanded it under Chief Hart. And one of the things that came with that, you're bringing in the community once again to help build on that relationship. And I'll give you an example how, one success. We had a young man one time that had a situation where he had a warrant for his arrest. And one of the law enforcement officers contacted the family, and it was a situation where, they weren't coming in. There was an arrest, and it was some trust issues, some concerns, and then the officer called me and asked me. We connected with the family, so I was able to meet the family at the police station outside, talk to the officers about what was going to happen. We assured them that everything was going to be above board, that they would walk them through the process and making sure that the young man, because just from, what you see on TV, they were just concerned. Simply, even though the young man was the one that was under arrest, they were concerned about bringing him to the police station. So not only was I able to meet them there, walk in with them, sit with the aunt who had really a breakdown right there at the station, but the way the officer handled it, because we knew how sensitive that compassion again, how sensitive the situation was, he was able to come out, talk to her, let her know what the next steps were, the court information, just walk through the whole process. They even went a step further, even took him to the back instead of doing everything right there, just said, we're just going to walk him to the back, let him know he didn't want to take off certain clothing. They walked him through why he had to do that. So it turned out to be it was very tense situation that was de-escalated and calmed down. But that partnership worked effectively right there. And then I was able to show up the next day at court with the family, who was just still emotionally charged, just to try to keep them calm. And the aunt who was there had left and just said, "Thank you guys so much." She said, because I thought I was about to have a heart attack. That was her words. And we let her know, no, we're here. We know he's got a situation that has to be legally resolved, but we're not trying to add to that. We're trying to de-escalate and make sure we walk them through the process. So that's a success story. And not too long ago, the grandmother who was involved but couldn't be there texted me just out the blue and was like, just want to thank you for that whole situation, what happened with you and the Linden Police Department. And I said, I responded, that's what we're here for,
So that's what a partnership is, right? I mean,
Partnership,
we talk about
right.
Community partners, and that's really what it is. And one of our attendees sent in it passed on the top of the screen real quick, and I think I got it, but Chief, it was a point of clarification on when you were talking about your ambassador program. The ambassadors on the shift are police officers who are on shift, but tasked to do that role, right? They're not civilians who are serving as ambassadors.
That's correct. Our philosophy is the whole department-wide. All officers, from the chief right on down to the detective, should embrace that philosophy. But these are officers assigned to patrol shifts. Yes.
And then when we were talking, Bishop, about partners, we're talking about stakeholders and members of the public who understand the importance of building that bridge between the community and law enforcement. Because after all, law enforcement is still part of the community. We are part of the community that we serve. And when we cease to be that, we cease to be effective. So, but I think the term, one of our listeners just wanted a point of clarification on that. So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the conversation. So if anybody else wanted to touch upon community outreach and its importance, now would be a great time.
Oh, Madam Prosecutor, to jump in, not only are our ambassadors off of the patrol ships, but they were also volunteers. They were men and women that volunteered to be ambassadors, to make that bridge between the community and the police department. No one was forced. No one was voluntold. These are young officers that wanted to make that bridge.
And also, Chief, you probably want to mention, I thought the summer program you guys did was a pretty good success with the youth.
The Youth Academy. Go ahead, Chief. That's wonderful.
Yes, unfortunately this year, because of COVID, we had to cancel. I was very upset. I held out till only a few weeks ago to cancel it. It would have been our third annual Youth Academy. It's a one-week program which many towns in Union County and throughout the state participate in. It's middle-aged, middle school type children, 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. It's a week-long program introducing them to all aspects of policing, get to know police officers as your friend, as part of the community, learn a little bit about law enforcement. We have special units that come in, and the bomb squad, the dogs, the forensics, and it's quite interesting. And even as an adult or child, you learn a lot, you have fun, and you get to see the cops as your friends and part of the community.
You know, that touches upon another topic altogether, and I know we're running out of time, but reaching our youth in the community to kind of foster that interest in law enforcement is so critical, because I think something that all of us are, you know, in leadership within law enforcement are looking to do is really to enhance our recruitment and expand it, because so often those that serve the community don't necessarily reflect it. And we work in one of the most diverse counties in the nation. I think we're ranked 13 based on the last census, but that's nationwide in terms of diversity. But I can tell you from where I sit, we don't see that in our applicant pool. And that is really trying to reach people very young and explain to them, you know, I go around and talk to children who have it or are in grade school about what a career in law enforcement can look like. Because I think they see what television portrays, and it's so much more than that. The prosecutor's office employs nurses and chemists and computer experts and civilians who do victim witness advocacy, as well as attorneys, and who do any number of different roles within a prosecutor's office. And the same with detectives. There is sort of this wide range of investigative careers that you can have within law enforcement. And, you know, very often people want to see changes and reform in law enforcement, but want to suggest it from the outside. And we welcome those suggestions, but it is very effective to make those changes from within. So I really do encourage any young people who might be attending or listening online to consider pursuing a career in law enforcement. And it could be in many different ways. You can join sort of criminal justice reform and law enforcement movements from within and really see an impact on service. And I think a lot of people enter this field because they want to serve, and to the extent we could continue to get that message out. And I think the Youth Academy really does that so well. Plus it's just a wonderful experience for the kids who sign up. Anybody else want to talk about community outreach? I know we're running out of time, so we'll close out this topic, and then what I'll do is I so enjoyed this conversation, and I really hope it continues. And for those who are joining us and listening to it live, or who are going to watch this recorded on the internet, I encourage you to continue to send us your questions, because we will endeavor to answer them. And we will definitely give it thoughtful consideration as we look at ways in which we can improve our policies and our procedures here in the county, and what we can then suggest back to the Attorney General's office, especially when it comes to use of force and changes in police training. So I thank each and every one of you, and I would love to give each and every one of you an opportunity to have closing remarks, anything you feel like we missed, or obviously there's a ton that we missed, but anything you'd like to get in before we close out for the evening, or anything that you take away from the conversation or the questions we received.
I'll start off, Prosecutor, and thank you again for this session, and I really appreciate the relationship that the prosecutor's office has with the Linden Police Department. I know Dave and I have worked together for many years, as well as myself and Abdul, who literally grew up across the street from each other, and having Bishop involved in that and allowing me to continue to at least listen in on the progress that continues to be made in Linden is really a big deal. I mean, my heart is and always will be with the Linden Police Department. So I'm very proud of the progress that continues to happen there. So great job, Chief and Captain, and thank you, Bishop.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to say anything before we sign off for the evening? I think it was Captain Russo who just, his comment posted on the screen, who now teaches at Union County College, reminded all of us that there are great opportunities for local kids to learn about criminal justice with him and his team there. So thank you for that. And anybody else want to touch upon anything before we end for the evening?
I'd just like to say thank you again, Prosecutor, for this opportunity to meet with my distinguished panelists here. I'm very proud to be the chief of this police department. Our officers and men and women in this Linden Police Department are dedicated professionals who take their job seriously. We continue to improve our training statewide and countywide of police officers in use of force and de-escalation. We continue to be transparent, which we strive for here in our department, and we continue with our community outreach. Those three main things: training, outreach, and transparency. We continue to build our bridges and resolve our problems as a community with the PDs in our state and our county and with our communities that we serve. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. And thank you all so much for your time, your expertise, your insights. For everybody who joined us, thank you for really taking the time out of your day to get engaged and to provide us with questions to address. And I hope everybody comes away with this with a little bit of new information, and I urge you to continue to submit stuff to us online, follow us on social media, and please make use of the Office of the Attorney General's use of force. They're taking suggestions online. We'll show that slide at the very end, but thank you all so much. And Bishop, I'm totally taking borrowing your acronym. I love it. Thanks for sharing that. And Chief and Captain, I commend you on the pledge you made tonight. That is huge. Thank you so much. That's really just tremendous. And Director, I know your heart's in Linden, but we're so happy we have you here at the prosecutor's office. So thank you all so much. Have a great night, everyone. Be safe and stay well. Thank you. Have a good night.
You as well. Thank you. Thank you.